Okay, thank you everybody, and hi. So thank you for joining me for Quick Shell Sharing is Caring about an RCE attack chain on QuickShare. So, as mentioned, my name is Or Yair. I'm the security research team lead at SafeReach. I have about 8 years of experience in security research with past research on systems, on Linux systems, embedded systems, and Android systems. Also lately, some AI projects that I presented here just this morning. And for the last 5 years, my main focus lies in vulnerability research in Windows environment and third-party apps that run on it. This is Shmuel Cohen. He is a primary contributor to this research, same as I, so credit goes to Shmuel Cohen as well. Okay, so let's see what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start for the reasons for why we chose QuickShare as a primary target for this research. We'll move on to get a quick overview about the protocol that QuickShare uses, then see how we managed to fuzz it, how we changed our research approach, and the vulnerability discoveries that came out of both approaches. Then we'll see an assembly of a very unconventional and creative RCE chain that we managed to assemble from the vulnerabilities that we found, and we'll finalize with takeaways and a link to the GitHub repository. So, for those of you who are not familiar with QuickShare, QuickShare is Google's nearby file transfer solution for Android, same as Google's AirDrop. And the reasons for why we chose it are a few. So, first of all, Google has recently announced a Windows version of QuickShare, allowing to share files between Windows computer and Android devices. Second, at CES 2024, they announced that they're working with leading PC manufacturers like LG to expand QuickShare to Windows PCs as a pre-installed app, making it a much more attractive target. Moreover, QuickShare performs file transfers using a variety of communication technologies such as NFC, Bluetooth, WebRTC, Wi-Fi, and more. And as far as we knew, it was Google's first time developing an application for Windows that uses the APIs required to use these communication technologies, so we thought that there will be more room for error. Regarding previous research, the only one that we could find was conducted at 2019, and it was done only on the API that QuickShare uses because QuickShare didn't even exist back then. It was done only on Android because the Windows version didn't exist, of course, and no CVEs were issued. Another interesting fact about QuickShare is that most of its code is open source, so that would be very helpful for research as well. And so concluding all of these facts together led us to evaluate QuickShare as a valuable and likely to be breached target. Our research goal was pretty straightforward. Find the first remote code execution vulnerability on QuickShare. And in order to do that, we had to start with investigating the protocol, which was not publicly detailed. So the first thing that we did was to find the two most basic functions that receive and send packets. They were found as the read and write functions as part of the base endpoint channel class, which was the base class for all communication technologies, which was good for us because we could generically see all sent packets no matter what was the communication technology. Deeper inside the read function, we were able to see that received bytes are parsed into an offline frame object. Now, the offline frame class was a class that was generated by Protobuf. For those of you who are not familiar with Protobuf, it's basically a generic way to provide a definition for a class that could be generated for a lot of different programming languages. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And it also generates functions that allow you to deserialize and serialize the object into bytes. So this was the offline frame definition. And by the way, don't be alarmed by the name offline frame too much, as offline frame is basically the base type for most packet types that QuickShare uses. And so I'll mainly refer to offline frames just as packets from now on. Okay, so at this point at the research, our first tool was born, and it was called QuickSniff. Basically, in order to understand the protocol, we needed a way to watch the communication live in order to understand how it works. So what we did was simply create a DLL that hooks the read and write functions, parses received and sent bytes into the offline frame object, and then use the protobuf functions in order to present the object textually and print it to the console so we could see all the sent and received packets in their textual form. And therefore, I'm now able to provide you with a quick overview of the protocol that Quickshare uses, or at least the parts that we managed to understand from it. So first of all, Quickshare is based upon an API that is called Nearby Connections API. And this API enables Android apps to discover, connect, and exchange data with nearby devices in real time, regardless of network connectivity. So Quickshare uses this API with its own implementation over it. Now, a few interesting facts about Nearby Connections API is that first, as we saw, it uses Protobuf. Second, for encryption, it uses Google's UKey2 library. Third, in order to distinguish between each application that uses the Nearby Connections API for its own purposes, each app chooses a service ID and advertises it. And there are multiple connection strategies, but we're going to focus on the peer-to-peer one, which is the one that Quickshare uses. Now, in the peer-to-peer strategy, we have an initiator and a responder that function much like a client and a server. In this example, we'll assume that the initiator is an Android phone and the responder is a Windows computer with Quickshare. So the communication begins with a connection request packet that is a type of an offline frame packet, followed by a UKey2 client init packet, which is not related at all to offline frame, just a part of the UKey2 library provided by Google. Then the responder responds with the UKey2 server init. The initiator finishes the handshake with the UKey2 client init finish packet. And at this point, the encryption handshake is done, ensuring that both devices has exchanged keys, and all subsequent packets from now on are encrypted in the communication. After the devices has exchanged keys, both devices send to each other a connection response packet, indicating that they would like to accept each other connections. And at this point, according to the Nearby Connections API, the devices are considered connected to each other, which is when the proprietary communication begins. Now, when I'm saying proprietary communication, I'm not talking about a random new protocol, but basically the Nearby Connections API provides a set of packets to use. It's done using a little bit higher API, but basically it's a variety of packets to use. So far, we saw the connection request and connection response packets. And from now on, we'll mainly focus on the payload transfer and bandwidth upgrade negotiation packets, which are the ones that are mainly used in the rest of the communication, in the rest of Quickshare's proprietary implementation. OK, so let's dive into it. So we were just there when the proprietary communication begins, right after the devices has accepted the connection. So after that happened, we saw that both devices send a payload transfer packet. However, the data that was inside this payload transfer packet was unclear to us. But fortunately, with the help of another protobuf file that we found in the open source project, we managed to see that the data was really another protobuf structure that was called paired key encryption, and we saw that this happens a lot in the rest of the communication. So we saw that in the same form, after the two first payload transfer packets, another two ones were sent, this time with a structure called paired key result. The purpose of these packets were not very clear, but using a few experiments, we were able to determine that the purpose of these packets was to enforce Quickshare's device visibility modes. Now, the device visibility modes basically define the entities that should be allowed to send files to the current device. There are 3 device visibility modes: your devices, contacts, and everyone, with your devices being basically any device that is connected to the same Google account of the current device. So after device visibility modes have been enforced over a payload transfer packet, just like we saw before, the initiator sends a file introduction packet with some information about the file that it would like to send to the responder. The responder is then prompted with a file introduction dialog and hopefully presses accept in a happy flow, which triggers it to send back an accept packet to the initiator. At this point, the initiator knows that the responder would like to accept the file and sends the actual raw file inside the payload transfer packet. And at this point, the file is written to disk on the responder's device into the downloads folder, and the communication is pretty much done. So we covered pretty much everything on a high level, from a high level perspective, from the network perspective. Now let's take a look at how this process looks like from a user perspective. Simply, we'll see a computer sending a file to an Android phone. So we choose Shmuel's phone. On the phone, we press accept, a file has been received, and now it's in the downloads folder. Pretty simple. Okay, and now that we understand the protocol much better, we can move on to fuzz it. So for the fuzzing infrastructure, we chose the most straightforward one for Windows, which was WinAFL. And for instrumentation, we combined it with DynamoReorg. Now, in order to mutate only the values of the protobuf structure without ruining the validity of it, we used libprotobuf-mutator that was created by Google and does exactly that. And then after a lot of obstacles and hard work, we managed to get the fuzzer up and running finally. Now, the fuzzer basically fuzzed, like mutated, an entire session on each iteration. It chose one random packet from an entire file sending flow. So for this reason, it was a little bit slower. But in general, it was pretty slow. The file transfer did take a lot of time. We did try to add some optimizations to Google's code. However, they, in the extreme velocity of the fuzzer, caused race conditions, so we got false positive crashes, so we decided not to use our optimizations, stayed with the original fuzzer. And although it was relatively slow, it did find some interesting reproducible crashes. But unfortunately, they were not exploitable. All that they enabled us to do is to remotely crash the Quickshare application. Another interesting finding by the fuzzer was a reproducible timeout. Basically, the fuzzer found a way to enable us to make a remote Quickshare application, repeatedly open a file that we choose from the victim's downloads folder. It was done simply by adding a null terminator prior to the file extension. Okay, so at this point, we had some fuzzing adventures. We managed to get the fuzzer up and running. It was pretty slow, but it did find results, but the results were not the thing that we aimed for. So we decided to change our approach to pure logical research instead of continuing to just perfect the fuzzer. And then, boy oh boy, we wished we had done it sooner. And the first vulnerability that we're going to talk about is a file acceptance bypass. So, if you remember, as part of this protocol, the initiator should first start with a file introduction dialog and wait for an accept packet to be sent back. Only then it knows that the responder would like to accept the file. But we do not care about whether the responder wants to accept the file or not. And also, thinking about the fact that Quickshare's code was so generic, complex, and filled with threads and async methods all over the place, we thought, what if we just skip the introduction and accept thence? Do we need it? And apparently, we found out that if we simply send a payload transfer packet with the raw file over it, then the responder just successfully receives it and writes it to disk, to the downloads folder, without any need for acceptance from the user. So this was pretty crazy. And not only that, this also bypassed any device visibility modes. It didn't matter which device visibility mode the target device was set to. We could send a file immediately to the downloads folder of the victim, both on Windows and Android. So this will be our first demo for this talk. Let's watch it. What we'll see here is an empty downloads folder on the Android device. Then we'll move on to the computer, run our exploit, and see how the file is placed on the Android device. So we see our device here set to accept file only from your devices, which are devices with the same Google account. We see an empty downloads folder. Now moving on to our computer, running our exploit. And taking a look at the downloads folder again, we see that the file is suddenly there. OK, cool. And now for our second vulnerability that was found manually, which includes forcing a Wi-Fi connection of a remote device. So in order to understand this vulnerability, we need to explain a term called bandwidth upgrade negotiation, which is present a lot throughout Quickshare's code. Basically, this term refers to the process of changing the communication technology during a nearby connection's connection in order to achieve better transmission speed. And Quickshare supports changing the communication technology to all the other communication technologies, such as we mentioned earlier, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, NFC, and so on, but even talking over a Wi-Fi hotspot that one of the devices sets up. And as you can see, one device can simply send the SSID and password to the other device and force it to connect to this Wi-Fi access point. Now, this bandwidth upgrade negotiation process was already leveraged in the past research that we talked about earlier, in order to force Android devices to connect to a rogue Wi-Fi access point. But this was done for about 30 seconds maximum, and since then it was already mitigated by Google. And you can now still force remote Android devices to connect to your Wi-Fi access point. However, they are disabled from using the internet through this Wi-Fi connection. However, testing the exact same idea on the Windows version simply allowed the Windows computer to connect to the internet. So that means that we can upgrade the communication technology to Wi-Fi hotspot, make the Windows computer connect to our Wi-Fi access point, and then for about 30 seconds, watch the internet connection, the internet traffic of our victim. OK, so these were all the vulnerabilities that we found. We found 8 vulnerabilities in total. They were cool. The most critical one was probably the one that enables us to send the file without approval. But it was not the holy grail. It was not the RCE that we aimed for. So at this point, we invented a sentence. And this sentence was, standard stones may sometimes be forged into deadly drones. So we really believe that there might be a way that we can still leverage these, maybe some part, at least some of them, seemingly basic vulnerabilities to create a very unconventional RCE chain. So as a reminder, the abilities that we had from these vulnerabilities is first creating files in the victim's downloads folder without approval. Second, force the victim to connect to our Wi-Fi access point for about 30 seconds maximum. Then, with a variety of vulnerabilities, also crash the remote Quickshare application. And lastly, force the remote Quickshare application to continuously open a file that we choose in the victim's downloads folder. OK, so enumerating these abilities, we had a crucial insight. And the insight was that the downloads folder to which we can write files to on the victim's device is the same folder where browsers that the user uses download their files to. And this led us to an idea. What if we could overwrite an executable that was downloaded to the downloads folder of the victim from the browser before the user runs it. If somehow being a Wi-Fi man in the middle can somehow magically help us understand which files are being downloaded by the victim, so we will be able to know their names. And if somehow we'll be able to escalate our ability to create files in the victim's downloads folder, to overwrite files in the victim's downloads folder, we might end up with remote code execution. So for a simple example, let's assume that the victim downloads the latest VS Code installer, and because we're a Wi-Fi man in the middle, we'll find a method to understand that, this is the file that was just downloaded. Then, if we also escalate our ability to overwrite files, then we'll be able to overwrite this file just before the user runs it. Okay, so since being a Wi-Fi man in the middle, at least we thought that it might help us anyways to detect file names that are downloaded, we decided that we'll start with making the Wi-Fi connection last longer. And then we came up with a pretty simple solution for that. We understood that we might already possess this ability because we understood that all that we need to do is to somehow prevent the remote quick share application from returning to its original Wi-Fi network after it connected to ours. So how can we do that? What if we simply crash QuickShare right after it connected to our Wi-Fi access point? And that worked. Once we crashed it right after it connected to us, we got a forever lasting Wi-Fi connection from the victim device. And regarding the option to continue to exploit QuickShare further, because we just crashed it, right? So it's not running. When QuickShare is installed, it creates a scheduled task that runs every 15 minutes and checks whether QuickShare is running. Then if it's not running, it launches it again. So we can continue to exploit QuickShare further, even after we got the forever lasting Wi-Fi connection, and it does not return to the original Wi-Fi network. Okay, so we now have our first two links for our remote code execution chain, which we expected to help us for identifying names of executables that the victim downloads. Now let's see the reason for why these links were very helpful for that. And this is the reason. Metadata matters. So looking at this picture, we thought that it explains exactly how we leverage the Wi-Fi man-in-the-middle connection to detect names of downloaded executables. It was indeed true that files are usually downloaded over HTTPS, meaning that the communication is encrypted, but HTTPS still had two very important elements in its metadata. The first one was server name indication. So the HTTPS protocol is encrypted using the TLS protocol. The TLS protocol starts with the client hello message to the server with an extension called server name indication that indicates the domain of the server. So even if the victim uses HTTPS, if we are the Wi-Fi access point of the victim, we can still determine all the domains to which the victim accesses. The second element present as part of the metadata of an HTTPS session is the approximate download size. So files are usually downloaded over HTTPS in one TCP session. So it is indeed true that encryption might add some random padding, but the approximate size of the download still stays relatively the same. So if you think about it, if we can determine the domain to which a victim accesses, and we know that a relatively large file was downloaded from there, and we know its approximate size, so we can also very accurately guess the name of the file that was downloaded. So for example, if we know that a victim accessed code.visualstudio.com and downloaded 95 megabytes, then it's safe to assume that it's the latest VS Code installer in probably 99% of the cases. Okay, and so we framed and defined our new man-in-the-middle technique a bit more specifically. In order to be as precise as possible, we understood that we need to define what we called domain paths. So a domain path is a sequence of domains to which we expect the victim to access until the download starts. So for example, if we'll talk about Notepad++, when you click the download button of Notepad++, the executable is not really downloaded from there. Instead, it redirects you to github.com, which redirects you to objects.githubusercontent.com, which is where the file is really being downloaded from. So we need to somehow address that. So to conclude, this is how we defined our new man-in-the-middle technique overall. So we start by creating a mapping between domain paths to executables that match these domain paths and their sizes. Then we wait until the victim hits a certain domain path in a limited time frame, and we start counting the downloaded data. Then, based on the downloaded size, we deduct the installer's name. And so now we chained another link to our RCE chain. We can now also detect names of a lot of executables that are downloaded by a potential victim. So we achieved the first thing that we needed for the RCE, but we still need to somehow gain the ability to overwrite files and not just create them. But it doesn't have to be the ability to overwrite files in any scenario. It could be the ability to overwrite files only in our very specific scenario, and that is when files are being downloaded. So what we thought about was, was to maybe somehow overwrite files in the downloads folder while their download is still ongoing. But in order to do that, we had to first understand Chrome's download process, at least a basic one. So according to our investigation, Chrome starts its download by checking if the file name that it wants to download already exists in the downloads folder. Then if it exists, it decides that the final name for the download will be suffixed with numbers surrounded by parentheses. And now the final name for the download has been decided. And the download starts, but into a temporary file with a CR download extension. Then, and only then, when the download has been finished and all the content was received, the temporary file is being renamed to the final name of the download that was decided on at the beginning of the process, not in the end. And what we thought about was that maybe we have a chance that to send a file that is named with the final name of the download while this download is ongoing. And then maybe if our file will exist there before Chrome is trying to rename the temporary file to the final name of the download, then maybe Chrome will fail to do that because our file with the same name will already be there. But in order to do that, as you remember, earlier I mentioned that to deduct the name of the executable, we must know the approximate size of the download. So we must wait for it to finish. So as the man in the middle, we can still do that. Because we are the man in the middle, we can wait for the last TCP packet to be received from the server, hold it in our hands without moving it forward to the client, and at this moment, we know that the download has been finished, but the client does not know that. At that same moment, we can send our file to the victim's downloads folder, and only after it was received and written to the downloads folder, release the last TCP packet, so the victim will finish the download. So at least this was our idea. we gave it a shot, and unfortunately, we failed. It did not work. Chrome just successfully finished the download and overwrote the file that we placed in its downloads folder. But it was not the end of it, because we felt so close and we understood that all that we need to find is somehow find a way to prevent Chrome from deleting our file. And then we understood that we can maybe already do that with the abilities that we had. So if you remember, our fuzzer earlier found a way to make QuickShare continuously open a file that we choose from the downloads folder. So what we thought about was that maybe after we send the file, we immediately also forced the victim QuickShare to continuously open the file that we sent, and only then release the last TCP packet to the client. So it will finish the download and try to rename the temporary file to the final name. But maybe because QuickShare uses our file, then Chrome will not be able to overwrite it and delete it. So we gave this last idea a try, and it worked. And it was actually the best scenario that we hoped for. Once Chrome finishes the download, the result is that it deletes the temporary CR download file. It fails to overwrite our malicious file. In its user interface, it reports that the download was finished successfully. And clicking on the downloaded file, both in File Explorer or in Chrome's downloads window, actually runs our file. So we achieved the remote code execution chain that we were aiming for. And now I'm able to provide you with a demo of the QuickShell tool that we created that implements this exploit. So what we're going to see here is first an attacker setting up a hotspot on its attacker Windows computer. And then we'll see how a victim is disconnected from their Wi-Fi network, connected to the malicious one, and then we'll see the further exploitation. So let's begin. So we see the mobile hotspot is set up. We can now see its IP address. We run QuickShell. Back then it was called QuickLeak, but ignore it. We're searching for victims. We find test machine. Now this is test machine connected to SafeBridge. Suddenly it's disconnected and connected to test AP, which is the attacker's hotspot. And now the attacker can see all the domains to which the client accesses. Now QuickShare was launched again on the client computer. The client browses into the Spotify website to simply download the latest Spotify installer. Now let's see the victim downloads the installer. The download was finished, the victim runs it, and our malicious executable runs instead. And now let's see that again with another executable. See that it's not, you cannot only target one, but you can target many. So let's see that with Notepad++. We download the latest Notepad++ installer. Let's see the download finished. Now it's 99%, the exploit is happening. We run it, and our malicious executable ran again. OK, so I know it might seem like we found exactly the vulnerabilities that we needed to find to build this remote code execution chain, but it was not actually exactly like that. We found two more vulnerabilities using the manual search. So first of all, we found the limited path traversal to the parent folder of the downloads folder, but it had to have a very specific name, so it was not very helpful. And we found another denial of service vulnerability. So overall, up to this point, we found 10 different vulnerabilities, and Google issued fixes for all of them. They were very cooperative. So after the fixes were issued, we went out to check them. Most of them did fix the actual issues, but there were two interesting surprises. Okay, so the first surprise was regarding one of the denial of service vulnerabilities that was found using the fuzzer. Basically, this denial of service vulnerability was caused due to invalid UTF-8 continuation bytes in file names. Now, you don't have to know what are invalid or valid UTF-8 continuation bytes, but the example that we provided was simply a file name that starts with a null terminator. Now, Google's fix for that was just to verify that null terminators do not exist in file names that they receive. So we simply bypass that by just replacing the null terminator with other invalid UTF-8 continuation bytes, and we got a denial of service again. But this was not the most interesting surprise, as the most interesting surprise was related to the file acceptance bypass that we found. What we saw when we re-ran our exploit after the issues were fixed is that our file was still written to the victim's disk, only that after a few seconds it got deleted. So digging further into Quickshare's code, we saw that they are looking for unknown files, which are the malicious files that we send, and then in the end of each file transfer session, they just delete them. You can see that here in the code. So since they were still written to disk, we thought that there is room to bypass this logic. We tried to think of a way to do that, and then we realized that they probably identify unknown files using a certain ID. And we knew that in the payload transfer packet that transfers the file, there's a payload ID field. So what we tried to do was to simply send two files with different content over two payload payload transfer packets, but provide two different, I'll tell it again, but provide the same payload ID for both packets. So again, two different files, two different contents, same payload ID for both. We thought that maybe Quickshare will think that only one file needs to be deleted while two were sent. So we tried that, and it worked. Only one file got deleted. So let's watch the last demo for this talk and see that new exploit in action. So we run our exploit, and now we'll see the two files were created, and after a few moments, only one got deleted. Okay, cool. So this was Google's response to our original report after we reported the 10 original vulnerabilities. They were very cooperative, and we want to thank them for that, really. So thank you, Google. Overall, Google decided to issue 3 CVEs for all the vulnerabilities that we found. The 2 first ones were issued for the 10 original vulnerabilities, and the third one was issued for one of the bypasses. And by now, we pretty much covered everything about the technical perspective of this talk, so we can move on to understand what do we learn from it. And our first and most significant takeaway from this talk is that standard stones may sometimes be forged into deadly drones. So what we mean by that is that as hackers, you often have limited tools at your disposal. You might achieve something, but maybe it's not the exact thing that you were looking for. Now, when we reflect on our research, we believe that even seemingly or unimpressive abilities can sometimes be transformed into something much more powerful. So we're all familiar with the typical chains of vulnerabilities that address known issues like bypassing stack cookies or other memory corruption mitigations, but it's not always so straightforward. Sometimes you might have unconventional abilities, like forcing an endless loop that repeatedly opens a file. So these abilities might sometimes help you create very unconventional flows that still allow you to achieve your ultimate goal. The next takeaway shifts to the defensive side. So many products leave known issues and bugs unfixed due to prioritization. Now, often these issues seem to pose minor security risks or no security risks, and they do not require immediate attention. But addressing these known issues or minor bugs can sometimes be crucial for mitigating a much larger risk that you might not even be aware of. So for example, in our case, if we did not have the denial of service vulnerabilities, then we wouldn't have been able to force a forever-lasting Wi-Fi connection, which would have completely disabled our entire remote code execution chain. And lastly, it's crucial for vendors that develop software to focus not only on specific programming mistakes like memory corruption bugs, but when you evaluate the security of your program, it's important to take a broader perspective and consider whether a simple logic or intended behaviors might also introduce security risks. Much like the bandwidth upgrade negotiation process that, by design, allowed to force remote devices to connect to our Wi-Fi access point. And with this last takeaway, I want to thank you all for joining me for the Quickshell talk. This is the QR code for the Quickshell repository, which includes the exploits for the vulnerabilities that I just showed, along with the entire Quickshell remote code execution chain. You can contact us via these social medias, and thank you. And we probably have some time for Q&A if someone wants to ask a question. Sure. Do you maybe want to come up to the mic? Yeah.
Hey, thank you very much for the talk. It was great. So just to clarify, the only prerequisites for a device to be vulnerable to this were physical proximity and having QuickShare installed?
Yes.
Wow, okay. Awesome. Thank you.
And a victim downloading an installer, right?
So I have a question with the research that you did on the Windows side of the things. Should the endpoint security have played an important role while you overwrite those files with the checksum validation and all?
You mean Windows?
Yeah, on the Windows system where
No.
not really, not even the antivirus or the endpoint security solution should have identified on
The what? Sorry, I cannot hear you very well.
So when the files were overwritten with your exploit, right? Should the endpoint security or the antivirus?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood you before. We didn't check that with endpoint security products.
I see.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Cool.
So another question? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just really a general question about patches and manufacturing, like the Red Hat.
Can you speak louder?
It's a general question about the Red Hat or any operating system releasing patches, like Google releases patches. Just wondering what your take on is with organizations protecting themselves using methods such as process monitoring and other methods of malware protection to protect the operating system from these kind of attacks.
Like, what is the specific question? Like, how do I think that?
You think it's an effective? Do you think it's an effective countermeasure to be able to the operating system to monitor for these type of processes?
I mean, this is a very specific process that you should, like, security products should probably monitor many more. But let's take it after.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. You all have a question too? Yeah. Okay.
Did you manage to check AirDrop, like
No.
for Apple?
Sorry.
Same idea. Might be some good.
Yeah, it's just not open source and not on Windows. Then this was our convenient way to go. Since it was deployed on Windows, it gave us a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
So this is one of the reasons that we suddenly noticed it too.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you everyone, and I'll be here if you want to have any other questions.